pastime, but decks of cards were very scarce. The mail was also very slow, with 2 months or longer being the usual time for delivery. My parents occasionally sent me parcels. Once they sent me long underwear in December, but I didn't receive them until July. So luckily the Red Cross and Salvation Army continued to supply us with the essentials. In one of the letters that I have here dated in 1944, Dad says to his mother and father, hey, don't send me long underwear, don't send me clothes, send me food. Anything I assume was allowed. I would guess you could send cans of Spam. Of course, packages of cookies and things you'd think would be a little suspect, because I don't know how long it took that stuff to get there. Certainly a couple months. I mean, you picture it's traveling across war-torn Europe, for crying out loud, in an airplane or a train or whatever. But food, and he says, don't send raisins. We're getting plenty of those. So anything he could get to eat was a welcome addition. Okay, next page. Some of the men put on a play at Christmas time. So, anything to occupy our minds, and I find a lot of similarities to what's going on there with what's going on with folks sheltering in place right now, creating memories, doing things. And think of it this way: the only difference is they had very limited resources, and they couldn't go to the grocery store. They couldn't run down to Walgreens or wherever and get a few items. They had to stay put. So some of the men put on a Christmas play, and they would put out plays at different times with men, yes, playing the women's parts. And I don't know that there's any photos of that in the Craigie Memories book, but I have seen photos of GIs where they would take any type of stuffing out of the mattresses and whatever to make a makeshift wig and create dresses and things so they could play the women's part in these plays. And he said we always enjoyed it. Of course, they always had a laugh about it. We were also able to attend a church in the camp administered by Father Kane, and he did services for both Protestant and Catholic. In the camp, we had men and boys from all walks of life, from cities to farm, from north to south, from east to west. A good discussion could always be had about the Civil War, with a fellow from Connecticut taking the side of the North one time or the South the next, and he always won the case. I'd like to know who that guy was. I'm betting he became one of the preeminent attorneys immediately following World War II, and maybe had been an attorney prior to the war. Incredibly, the Jerrys allowed us to have a 4th of July celebration. Now, one of my other favorite movies that I haven't mentioned to this point, and I have a feeling a lot more of you have seen this movie than have seen Stalag XVII, and that's The Great Escape, with Steve McQueen, James Coburn, Donald Pleasance, James Garner. I mean, it's a 1960s classic, and of course it has that famous scene with Steve McQueen on the motorcycle. But my point there is, in that movie, they have a 4th of July celebration. As a matter of fact, the guys make hooch. They make kind of a moonshine product, I think, out of potatoes, and they create a still. And on the 4th of July, they dress up like the Spirit of 76 and march through the camp and pass this out. Now, I can't say that that did or didn't happen, but my point was that 4th of July celebration evidently was something that many of the camps allowed. Now, we talked about the Russians before being in a different camp and actually being moved out of this camp. The Russians were in another part of the camp. The Germans did not like them. I guess that would be putting it mildly, as they say. And since the Russians were not members of the Geneva Convention, they did not receive Red Cross parcels. So if you didn't sign on to the Geneva Convention for the humane treatment of prisoners, it worked both ways. You treated the American prisoners right, and the Americans treated the German prisoners right. But there was no such agreement between the Germans and the Russians. Stalin, I believe, refused to sign. So what happened there was they didn't receive Red Cross parcels. And Dad says many died in camp. I think tens of thousands died in camp. So it was not unusual to see a Russian funeral. When the Russian funeral procession would go by our compound, we would stop and stand at attention to honor the dead. This really angered the Germans. I want to show you a photo now that means an awful lot to me, and I'm just sorry we're not on horizontal mode as we were before, but I couldn't get it to kick back on to horizontal. So I'll show this photo. I've posted it on Facebook before, but I'll, if I remember, I'll post this one. I'll wait till Monday with Easter being tomorrow. But I'll post this one. This is one of my favorite photos, and I want to share what happened with this photo. So I'm going to hold it up here, and I'll hold it back a little bit. I'll try to. I'm going to have tilted at an angle. But if you look right here, this guy in the dark uniform, and again, I'll post it on Facebook. That, folks, is my dad. That is my dad at age 23 in a black Red Cross basketball uniform, playing basketball, and I don't know the exact moment that this is taking place, but I can tell you that Dad talked about and he documented a camp championship, and a team was put up from each barracks, so 36A, 36B, etc. And they had basketball tournaments, a la NCAA or a la, the NBA. And believe it or not, Dad's team played and won the championship game. But the coolest part is not even that. The coolest part is that this photo even exists. And as I say, there he is right there. That's my father in the dark suit. There's 9 guys in this photo, and the 10th guy's the one with the ball because nobody in the photo has the ball. I gotta love that. Things haven't changed in basketball. Look at this guy getting the elbow from the guy on Dad's team. Dad's team's the dark colors. And he talked about that. But here's the interesting thing about that photo. That photo, as far as we knew, did not exist till around 2004. And here's what happened. Here's the story on this picture. My son was in a program at school, extracurricular activity called Quiz Team. And some of you knew what that was. It was a contest, and actually here locally won on WWII, and schools competed against other schools. And so Sean was on that team with 3 other guys and gals from Coshocton High School, and it was, I don't know what you want to say, their counselor, their leader, the teacher that worked with them and helped them study for these things and was their cheerleader and decided who the first team was and who the backups were and all that, was the German teacher. And at that time, her name was Lisa Werner. I know Ruth Edwards was the teacher before this because I know Ruth personally, but Lisa, I think, may have been the teacher that came in when Ruth retired. So Lisa was the German teacher. One night after this quiz team final at Zanesville, and by the way, Coshocton did win that. They beat Fisher Catholic for the championship that year. My dad was so excited. We took him and Mom to WHIZ studios, and we sat off to the side and were actually able to watch as part of the so-called studio audience. So after we won, Dad said he was paying for dinner for the whole team and, for Mrs. Werner. And so everybody was pretty excited about getting a free meal. So the kids wanted to go to Olive Garden. So we all went to Olive Garden. Dad paid the bill, and he sat at the head of the table with Mrs. Werner. And he said, "I understand you're the German teacher." And if you know my dad, he was a homespun guy, down to earth. And she said, "Well, yes, I am." And he said, "Well," he says, "I spent a little time over Germany and in Germany, and then I spent a lot more time in Austria." And she says, "Oh, really? You visited there?" And Dad says, "Well, yeah, kinda. I was a prisoner of war." Well, this fascinated Mrs. Werner, and she began to ask him questions about where and how long and all that. And she was going to be going to Vienna, Austria, as part of a trip she was taking that next summer. I think it was the summer of 2004. I could be a year off. And so she went over, and a few months later, when she came back or bumped into Dad, she said, "Mr. Baker, I've got something for you. I have a present for you." And he says, "Oh, really? What's that?" And she says, "I found in Krems, Austria, I visited where your camp was, and I found a book about Stalag XVII. And she says, I brought it back, I read it, and I'm giving it to you as a gift." And he goes, "Well, thank you very much." And she says, "Well, don't thank me too much," because she says, "It's written in German." okay? The book is written in German, but it has some photos in it, and I just thought you should have it, and I've read it. So Dad said, well, thank you very much, and he took the book, and a friend of his, Bill Edwards, who was Ruth Edwards, the former CHS German teacher's wife, read bits of it and told Dad some of the stories in it. And what Dad found out was most of the book was about the Russian part of the prison camp on 17B. But ironically, there were photos in the book. Not ironic that there were photos, but ironic that this photo was in the book. So Dad looked through the book very casually, looking at all the pictures, and I got a phone call one evening. And he says, Gary, I want you to come over here and look at this book. He lived in Coshocton on Eagle Drive at the time. So I drove over, and he says, I want you to go through this book. There are only about 20 photos in it. And he said, I want you to tell me if I'm in one of those pictures. I said, do you think you're in one of those pictures? And he says, yeah, I think I'm in one of those pictures. I said, okay, let me take my time and go through the book and look at the photos. Some of the photos were nondescript. You couldn't really make the faces out that well. So I skimmed through the book, and I came to this one picture. And we had sat, and Dad had shared enough stories with me over the years. I knew that he played on the basketball team, and I knew that he was in a camp tournament. So as I saw this basketball photo, I began to peruse it pretty, diligently. And trying to picture in 2004, my dad was 84 years old. So trying to picture my 84-year-old father as a 23-year-old man, I've seen class photos. I had seen maybe that one basketball photo that I showed you the other night. But what's a 23-year-old man that's your dad that's now 84 look like? And I looked and I looked and I looked and I went, that's you. And he goes, that's me. And he started naming all the guys on his team 70 years later. And he said that the guy behind him, right here, he said his name was Cherry. And he said he was too tall to fly on a B-17. He was a mechanic. But we'd lost so many men, he kept saying, put me in, coach. You know what I'm saying? I want to fly. I've had gunnery training, but I'm a mechanic over here at the same air base. He ended up flying, not on Dad's plane, on a different plane, and the first mission that he was on, he was shot down and ended up in prison camp. But Dad knew him. He was an acquaintance. They were in the same barracks. They played on the same basketball team. So he named all the guys on the team. So I knew that was for real. So that's been a real treat. It's probably been the most exciting, kind of like finding a holy grail, if you was. And we called Mrs. Werner and thanked her profusely. And, of course, she had no idea. I mean, it was just one of those one in a million things. And I'm so grateful that she found that photo. And the lady that published that book was Austrian, and I actually was able to get an email address for her and contact her, but she could not tell me where she got the photo. She believes she got it at a POW convention in the United States, but she couldn't tell me who gave it to her. So she couldn't credit the photo, thus Dad couldn't find who took the shot. Anyway, we'll move on. In the winter of 1944, we had some good times and some very hard times. When the Red Cross packages were regular, the times were mostly good. But when we got down to 3 or 4 men per parcel, times got a lot tougher. So if you only got one a week, you could live pretty good. But if you had to split it with 2 guys, you could do okay. But picture what happened when you got to 3, 4, 5, I think even one time he says up to 6. There wasn't much there. You'd have been really, really hungry. We would always perk up when we received news that the Russians were advancing or the Germans had stopped. We thought the war would be over in 6 months or less. Now, he's talking in the winter of 44, so maybe December of 1944. One night, we jumped out of bed to the sound of gunfire, a blowing siren, and the brightness of the shining lights in the compound. We heard lots of yelling and gunfire, and guards ran into the compound and each of the barracks with guns drawn. We learned that 2 GIs had tried to escape but had been shot. By the amount of gunfire, we assumed there were a lot more than 2 men. It was a long night with the Germans yelling and screaming orders to everyone to be quiet, and stay in bed, and the constant barking of the dogs. At daybreak, we had a roll call on the compound, and the 2 bodies of the unsuccessful escapees had been laid out on the ground. We stood at attention where the dead soldier bodies laid, and the bodies stayed there for 2 days so that we would not forget. These 2 GIs and another sergeant who died at another time were the only men that Dad was aware of that they lost with the 15 months we were at 17B. So he confirms there he was there 15 months. I want to say something just briefly about that. If you watch the movie Stalag 17, which I've mentioned a couple times before, there it is right there. If you watch the movie, they refer to the men in the movie as Manfredi and Johnson, and the film actually opens with that. That's the opening scene. So I'm sorry, spoiler alert, but I just wanted to say there is truth in a lot of the events that took place in that movie, and the attempted escape by the 2 GIs is one of those. The English made air raids on the town of Krems at night. The bombs lit up our whole camp because we were very close to town. When we looked out the windows at night, it was as bright as daylight. We were not allowed to go into the air raid trenches at night. I think they were afraid they'd find a way to escape. In the daylight, we would go outside and watch the B-17s and B-24s fly over. They were bombing Vienna, Austria, which was about 50 miles away. We had seen German, American, and English planes go down in the distance. So they're trapped, they're tied up, but the air war is still taking place over their heads, and that's pretty amazing. In the summer of 1944, it was a quiet time because of the invasion in France, meaning D-Day. The Germans were gentler because the war was coming to an end with the Russians in the east and the Americans and their allies in the west. We were sure the war would be over by Christmas of 1944, but it was not. We were able to keep up with the progress on a contraband radio and by a newspaper the Germans would give us. That's kind of amazing that the Germans would give them a newspaper, so somebody in the camp obviously could read German. But the other thing, contraband radio, those of you that used to watch Hogan's Heroes, they always had a contraband radio. And again, in the movie Stalag 17, there is a contraband radio. Another spoiler alert. We celebrated the holidays better in 1944 than we did in 1943. Although food was still a big concern, we didn't worry too much because we knew it was only a matter of time until we would be free. In 1945, we were looking for the end. We would wonder who would reach us first, the Russians from the east or the Americans from the west. Then we heard about the Battle of the Bulge, and if you do your history on that, that was not a good time. That's Bastogne. If any of you have watched Band of Brothers, that's the war at Bastogne, the Battle of the Bulge in 44. And when we heard of the Battle of the Bulge, it was very upsetting because we thought the war was just about over. We continued to see B-17s and B-24s at different times, so we knew we were still winning the war. On April 5th, 1945, we got a new Jerry captain who was kinder than the last commandant. We found out why the next day. And that's where I'm going to leave you tonight. We found out why the next day. It's always fun to leave on a cliffhanger, isn't it? Keep you watching. So, gosh, thanks everybody for joining. I'm sorry this tape's going to be split into 2 pieces until I can figure out how to splice it together. I do fair on this kind of stuff, but I'm no gearhead or tech head. So it'll probably be shown in 2 pieces. The first half, just look for it. I'll have the same outfit on I've got in both sections there. And I wanted to give a shout out to the Ohio State Buckeyes tonight, so I put a Buckeye hat on and a Buckeye shirt. And I suppose that's maybe a la what Mike DeWine's doing on his 2 o'clock press conferences with a shout out to the different colleges. So this is one of my alma maters. It's where I got my master's degree. So I love Ohio State, and we hope all this is over before fall. But we know the number one thing is we all got to stay safe. And I thank you guys for joining me. And we'll have one more night, and the next night will be about a forced march 300 miles across the heart of Austria as the war is coming to an end, and of course freedom at long last at the end of that trail. So that will be on Monday night at 7, and I think we'll be able to wrap it up. And gosh, I thank so many of you for hanging in so many nights. It's awesome that you would stick around and listen to this. And I have one young lady saying, my dad was in the Battle of the Bulge. And another young lady saying, my father-in-law was in the Battle of the Bulge. I mean, to me, isn't it something? It's all American history. And this brings up a good point. And thanks, Karen Shepard, and thanks, Diane McCormick Hall, for sharing that. And other people may have posted things, but unfortunately, I've lost them as they scroll up as new stuff comes on. But I just want to say, this is just one story out of hundreds of thousands. And I wanted to share this story of my dad because, number one, he wrote it down and we can share it. And number two, I'm not so sure it's not unlike what's going on right now. He was fighting an enemy that they understood. We're fighting a hidden enemy. A lot of sacrifices had to be made. And unfortunately, whether we like it or not, some folks have had to die, and certainly some folks have been very, very ill. And so I just pray that you're all staying safe. Love you all. Thank you for joining me. I hope we didn't lose too much. I'll watch the tape later tonight and see if there's any pieces we missed, and I'll try to just re-record those privately and shoot them out there so you get all the pieces of the puzzle together. And eventually I'll post these on YouTube. So again, if you came on late, I lost my Wi-Fi about halfway through, and so you'll have to watch it in two sections, one horizontal and one vertical. And thanks, everybody, for coming. Have a great evening. Have a happy Easter. I know y'all won't be with all the family and friends that you want to be with, but you know what? Let's stay safe, and we can be with them all next year. So, adios. God bless. He is risen. He is risen indeed. And best wishes to all of you for a happy Easter. Bye-bye.